Today we will start a new topic on processes, threads and scheduling. Today's class is going to be somewhat of a recap or a refresher on some undergraduate concepts in processor and thread scheduling. We are going to build it up from that point on, and starting next time we'll talk about distributed scheduling, multiprocessor scheduling, virtualization and more advanced topics that are actually part of the course. Okay, so let me, before I start the lecture, start with a computing parable. Relate parables occasionally to just liven up the class. So this one is going to be in two parts. Okay, I'll talk about the first part today, another part next week. So it's about the lion and the rabbit, and it has to do with grad students as well. So the rabbit is the graduate student, and there's a rabbit who is typing away in a forest. And a fox comes along and the fox says, what are you working on? So the rabbit says, I'm working on a paper titled How Rabbits Eat Foxes. And the fox says, that's absurd. Everyone knows that rabbits don't eat foxes. So then the rabbit says, come with me, I'll show you. And he takes him in the cave, and the rabbit comes out after a while and the fox does not. Then a little while later, a wolf comes along, and the rabbit is still typing. And then the wolf asks the rabbit, what are you working on? And the rabbit says, I'm working on a paper titled How Rabbits Eat Wolves. And then the wolf says, that's rubbish. Everyone knows that nothing like that can actually happen. So the rabbit says, come, I'll show you, and takes him into a cave. And then after a while, the rabbit comes out and the wolf has disappeared. So then after a while, the rabbit goes in, and inside the cave, there's a lion and a pile of bones. So that's the story. And then you can ask, what does this mean? What's the moral of the story? So the moral is basically, if the rabbit is the graduate student and the lion is the advisor, says choose your advisor wisely and you can get away with everything. So next time we will continue this and say, listen to the next part. So we'll start with the review. Well, actually I had one thing from last time I did not mention. So we were talking about distributed system architectures last time. There was one slide I did not cover towards the very end, which was on self-managing system. So we have seen over the last class a whole variety of distributed system architectures, from event-based, middleware-based, client-server, peer-to-peer, and so on. One that I did not mention, which is autonomous distributed system. Okay, so these are any of these architectures that we talked about. If you also have intelligence in the system, so that the system can make decisions autonomously without human or system administrator intervention, these are referred to as self-managing systems or autonomous distributed systems. And the way they all roughly work is they have three components. So they monitor themselves, so they could monitor the workload or monitor the system state and do some analysis of what they are observing as far as the system is concerned. And based on those observations, you can actually enforce some control. It could be control, theoretic control, or just some other form of control to take some actions. And all this loop will continue without any human intervention. So that's basically the intelligence part. And this is often used in many scenarios. If you go and look at cloud computing platforms, they allow you to vary the capacity of your server dynamically based on the workload without any user intervention at all. So if you have a website with, let's say, only one machine, and then the workload on that machine goes up, if the workload exceeds the capacity of the server, the website will go down in the normal case. Okay. If you have a self-managing or an autonomous system, what that web server can do is actually analyze the incoming workload, can monitor the workload and analyze it. And if it sees that the workload volume is rising and is going to exceed the capacity, or the utilization of the system is going to exceed the capacity, it will take automatic decision, let's say, to start a second server or an I+1 server, which will add to the capacity of the system as a whole and allow it to continue requests. So you can vary the capacity of your system dynamically based on workload. Workload goes up, the capacity is increased, so you don't have to turn away requests saying server is overloaded and things like that. So that's a popular scenario where autonomous systems like these are used. There will be others that we will look at as we go along. Okay, so that was the very last architecture that we had wanted to discuss last time. So with that, we will switch gears, come to processes, threads, scheduling, virtualization, and so on. So today's chapter lecture, as I said, is actually going to start mostly as a review of some undergraduate concepts, and then we will build it from there. Okay. So you probably all know what a process is. Okay. So I'm assuming that we don't need to discuss. So we'll distinguish between multi-programming and multi-processing. Okay. Multi-programming essentially says that your OS kernel is able to handle multiple processes that are executing concurrently in the system. Okay? And it can schedule these processes so that they can all make progress. Okay? So you can have multi-programming even on a single core system. Okay? You can have multiple processes running, and your CPU scheduler will cycle through the processes or give each process some CPU time so that they can all make progress. Okay, multi-processing, on the other hand, generalizes this by adding more than one processor or core to the system. Okay. Even in this case, you will have multiple processes, and these processes will be scheduled on the different processors, and you will have real parallelism. Okay. If there are two processes running on two different cores or processors, they are actually running in parallel. In multi-programming, you may have concurrency, which means that you will have processes making progress, but if there's only one core, you will not have any real parallelism. Okay, you will basically have to schedule them one after another. Okay, so that's the distinction between multi-programming and multi-processing. Okay. The kernel is responsible for scheduling processes or tasks, or even threads for that matter, using whatever resources it has. Okay. And it would have to maintain several data structures. Okay. The kernel has to be aware of what processes are running, what they're doing, how much memory has been allocated, and so on. So the kernel data structure that's used for this is called the PCB, process control block. Okay. Each process is assumed to have an address space. Yeah, I'll show you some examples in a picture in just a minute. So the address space contains all of the memory state of that process. Okay. Typically, a process has multiple segments. The code or the text segment is actually the binary instructions of the process. Okay. You will have a stack segment and a heap segment which will store data. A heap segment is dynamically allocated variables. Anything you malloc or do new or run constructors on the fly is put in the heap. Okay, the stack segments are all variables that are actually local to a function or a method that's being executed. Okay, so processes have segments, they have variables, and they contain code. And typically the way a process executes is to a sequence of transitions. So I'll just draw a picture which we look at in some detail in an undergrad class. So the transitions are fairly straightforward. Okay, so that's a state transition diagram or a finite state automaton that captures the transitions a process makes. Very straightforward. You always start, and when a new process starts up, it starts up in new. This is when all of its data structures are being set up in the kernel and the process is being loaded from disk. Once that is done, it goes to the ready state. The ready state essentially tells the CPU scheduler that the process is ready to execute but it's not yet executing. CPU scheduler will eventually choose this process for execution. It will be given a code. Okay. At that point, it starts running. This is when it's actually executing. Okay. While it is running, if it does any I/O, okay, it will block. Okay, because we assume that I/O instructions require you to make a system call transition to kernel and now the kernel execute it. So basically if you do IO, you will go to wait or an IO state and wait for the IO to finish. Okay, once the IO finishes, you will go back to the ready state and wait for your turn again. Okay. So you will cycle through these processes. Now if you have a CPU bound process, you may not do any IO. So you will run for as long as the CPU scheduler allows you to run. If the CPU scheduler is preemptive, it will use time slices. Okay, so each you will be given a certain amount of time slice, you run. If your time slice expires, you have to give up the CPU for some other process to run. In that case, you will simply go from run to ready and wait for your next time slice. Okay, so you will either transition from run to wait to ready, or you will transition from run to ready. So you will keep executing in this fashion until the code is done, and we basically go to terminate state. Okay, very straightforward state transition picture that captures how processes execute. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so the CPU scheduler is going to look at all the processes or threads that are in the ready state and pick one for execution. That's the job of the CPU scheduler. Okay, so I will look at CPU scheduler in just a moment. So those are the processor or process state transitions. Okay. Now there are many different scheduling algorithms, policies that you can use to decide which of the many processes that are in this ready state get to execute next. Okay. Every time, let's say, time slice expires, who gets to run next. Okay. So those are examples of preemptive schedulers. You can also have non-preemptive schedulers which simply schedule a process and let it run until it finishes. Okay. Or it basically gives up the CPU itself by going into wait state. Okay, so we are not going to worry about non-preemptive because most schedulers will use time slices and are preemptive. Okay, so here are some policies that you can use. Round robin, okay, very straightforward. You will basically assume there's a queue of processes that are ready. Okay, any process that's in the ready state is in this queue. So you are going to cycle through them in a round robin fashion. You take the first one, give it certain time slice. Time slice expires, it goes to the end of the queue, and you just cycle. Very straightforward policy. The shortest job first basically says you look at the ready queue, pick the shortest job, or the shortest process that you have, and then execute it next. Okay. This policy you can show as optimal in terms of waiting time, okay, but it is not a practical policy to implement. You will remember why?
No one may.
So shortest job first essentially says you need to know the length of your process or the job. Okay, that's how you are going to pick the shortest job. If you knew that length, you could of course implement this policy. But if you think about any general purpose operating system, you start a browser, how does the OS know what is the amount of time it's going to execute before it finishes? Okay, that's up to the user. User may continue using it for a long time or not. So for any process, you cannot actually predict, you cannot estimate the job of, you could of course try to guess and predict and use that guess, but that's only going to be a guess. So typically OS kernels don't have the knowledge of length of the job. They only know what the processes are doing now. They don't know what's going to happen in the future. Okay? So it's an optimal policy in terms of the waiting time of jobs. We can prove that it's optimal. No technique can do better, but it's not a feasible one to implement in practice. FIFO is very straightforward. First come first, also we skip that. Okay, lottery scheduling is a randomized algorithm. Okay. So what happens in lottery scheduling is each job that's in the ready queue, okay, is given some number of lottery tickets. Okay. The number of tickets will determine how much CPU time you will get, and you will see how that is done. So what happens is whenever the CPU scheduler runs, it looks at all the processes in the ready queue. Okay. It takes all of the lottery tickets, and it runs a lottery. Okay. Think of it as you take all the tickets, you put it in a hat, and you pick one. Okay. The process that holds that winning ticket gets to run next. Okay. So it's purely random because you will use a randomized technique to pick a winning ticket. Okay. So which process gets to go next is randomly determined by who gets to win, who wins the lottery each time. So now you can control how much tickets each process is given. That's up to the user. And by controlling that, you can control how much CPU time you get, what fraction of the CPU you will get. Okay, so let's assume there are only two processes, and each of them is, let's say, given 10 tickets. So then you have 20 tickets every time the lottery is run. The probability that some process wins the lottery is half. Okay, so each process gets half of the CPU. Yeah, half of the time slices go to process A, the other half goes to B. Okay, if you give one process one ticket and the other process two tickets, then they'll get CPU time in the ratio 1:2, which means that the first one will get a third, second one will get a 2/3. Okay, because this is going to win the lottery, it has twice as many lottery tickets. Okay, so over some period of time, you will get twice as many time slices. Okay, over some long periods of time, because it's probabilistic, you will approach that fraction. Okay, so you can control the number of tickets you give to a process and thereby control how much CPU time that process is going to take. Okay, that's lottery scheduling. EDF stands for earliest deadline first. It is a real-time scheduling algorithm. Okay, so what does that mean? Sometimes there will be processes that need real-time service, that have timeliness constraint, that they need to execute a certain task by a certain time. Otherwise, there's going to be a problem in terms of either the correctness of the application or the user perceived performance. Okay? So in this case, when a process is ready to run, it also has a deadline associated with it, which says that you can run the process any way you want, but you need to try to make sure the process gets at least the next time slot before this deadline due. If you miss the deadline, then the process is going to have problems executing. What earliest deadline first simply says is you look at the ready queue, look at all the deadlines of the processes that are in the ready queue and simply pick the one that is the earliest. Okay, the one deadline that's going to come up next, and you basically schedule them in deadline order. Okay. It's a very popular technique used in real-time kernels. Okay, most operating systems that you see that are general purpose are not designed for real-time usage, but there are a whole class of operating system kernels that are designed to ensure real-time performance. Okay. And there are many different scenarios where you may need real-time. Okay. Think of mission-critical applications like control of an airplane or control of actuators in a nuclear reactor. Okay. You want to do things very precisely by certain time. Okay. Otherwise, you may have catastrophic consequences. Okay. Those are scenarios where tasks need to run by certain times in order to ensure that the correctness of the system is not compromised. So tasks are actually given deadlines when they run, and then the scheduler will ensure that they run by the deadline. Okay. Using EDF. Okay. The closest example you can think of that has timeliness constraints in general purpose operating system is media playback, audio and video playback. Okay. So if you think about how video is played out, okay, typically what happens is in a video file, you have video file consists of a sequence of images, okay, and you play them out at a certain rate. Each image is slightly different from the first, so when you just display them one after another, you get the illusion of that things are moving and so on. Okay. So there is something called a frame rate for a video. It basically says you may have, let's say, 4 frames per second, so you need to display 24 images every second. Okay. Or you may have 30 frames a second, that's standard for many video. So 30 frames says every 33 milliseconds you need to display the next image. Okay. If you just take a longer time to display it, the user will see a playback glitch, the video will seem to freeze for a little bit and then it will continue. Okay. That's not desirable from video playback performance standpoint. So that could be thought of as a timeliness constraint where each frame is decoded and displayed every 33 milliseconds. Okay, so that's an example of real-time scheduling. Clearly, you can schedule these tasks without enforcing this real-time performance. So long as the load on your system is not high, you still see good performance. That's how general purpose operating systems still make those tasks work. Okay. That's a quick run through of processor scheduling algorithms, the uniprocessor world. Yeah, we'll talk about more advanced ones. Are there any questions on this? Okay. So the choice of a particular technique depends on what you are trying to achieve.